Welcome to Fireside Chats, a series of curated conversations as part of the Data Values Project. I'm here with Bronwen Robertson. She is the co-founder and director of Data for Change, a UK-based nonprofit with a global network made up of journalists, data scientists, and designers who collaborate on data-driven projects for social impact. Bronwen has spent her career supporting society and human rights organizations to use data-driven advocacy to amplify their stories. And so today, Bronwen has joined us to talk a little bit about the role that data storytelling has in data literacy and in communicating important social problems and making change with data. So welcome, Bronwen.
Great, thanks so much. That was a fantastic introduction. I'm really looking forward to having the conversation.
I'm so glad that you joined us. Thank you. Do you want to just start with talking a little bit about data storytelling, what you do, and the connection between data storytelling and data literacy?
Yeah, maybe I can kind of start from the end and the beginning and meet somewhere in the middle of that question, because I think storytelling is something that we all do. And actually, data is probably something that we all use, even if we're not super aware of it. It's definitely something that underpins pretty much everybody's life. And I think that civil society organizations that we work with, and probably in general, the modus operandi is to produce quite lengthy niche reports on topics that really, really matter. And so one of the main reasons that we started Data for Change was so that we could help civil society organizations to repurpose some of that really important information into things that would, I guess, appeal to a broader range of people, and also to be able to shift that content and communicate it in different ways, whether that's sort of communicating data back to their communities or whether it's communicating data with policymakers. The sort of purpose behind the communication is different, so the mechanism that they use to communicate should also be different. And so looking at the different ways that we can use to tell stories that might not necessarily be a chart, even if we're talking about data. And I guess that's kind of an important point when we talk about data literacy, is that a lot of underserved communities and marginalized or at-risk groups have lower levels of literacy in general. And so if we're thinking about data literacy as being able to read a chart or operate a spreadsheet, maybe we're sort of reinforcing barriers that don't need to be there. I think that it's possible for everybody to gain some confidence, data confidence rather than data literacy. So being able to sort of speak about numbers with confidence. Storytelling doesn't have to be written down. We've done a lot of work with community members where we're looking at audio broadcasts. For example, during COVID, one of our partners in Ethiopia works with persons with visual impairment. And we were doing a rapid needs assessment with them, and they discovered that their community members weren't able to access important information about how to protect themselves from COVID-19 because it wasn't being produced in an accessible format. So we worked with them to take all of the data and information about COVID and create audio broadcast messages, which they then broadcast on the back of an SUV using a loudspeaker in areas where their community of visually impaired persons live. And so being able to do something like that instead of kind of focusing on trying to shoehorn people into being able to read charts, but actually using numbers in a way that is meaningful to different audiences can be really important.
To that point, could you give us some examples, in addition to the one you mentioned in Ethiopia, about the types of data that we're talking about here and the types of problems that we can use that data to solve? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think maybe it's flipped though. I think maybe we look at kind of what are the problems to solve first. And then one of the things that we do at Data for Change is called data maps and gaps. So we come up with a series of really important questions around a topic first. And then we look at all of the different possibilities that there might be for existing data, whether that's open data, whether that's data that the organization might already have, and data gaps. So what are the things that we want to be able to speak about, but we don't think that data exists yet? And this could be anything from one of the projects we're working on at the moment in Kuwait about educational inclusion. One possible data source could be measuring the width of doorways across all of the schools in Kuwait to check whether accessibility requirements are adhered to, for example. Or we could be looking at anything from survey data or kind of pre and post testing data, which a lot of civil society organizations already do, to more sort of community data capture things. This year we worked with, at the end of last year, we worked with a partner that has a community center in Matari in Nairobi, and they created a series of murals next to their community center and invited community members to come and essentially put their data on the walls. So they created a kind of series of visualizations that were really easy to access and to understand, and then invited people to put handprints where they're kind of responding to different questions, and to create a line chart, taking pieces of yarn and threading them over and above different nails to kind of plot their own line on a line chart, and then sort of interacting with data in a way that's not scary, because I think a lot of people think about data literacy and immediately jump to mathematics or numeracy and Excel spreadsheets. And I am the biggest fan of the spreadsheet. Our designer even bought me a cap that is Excel green and says spreadsheets on it. But it's very difficult to get people excited about spreadsheets if you're not framing that within the potential for impact that working with numbers can have. And that can be done using Lego to visualize different data. That can be done. We've even created essentially a human spreadsheet at an in-person event before. So trying to break down the barriers that exist and that put people off working with numbers.
And why does it matter? Why is that so important? Why does it matter that people can interact with and understand the potential impact of what is typically found in a spreadsheet?
I mean, that's a really big question. But I think one of the answers to that question is because there are already people who are using those numbers to make decisions about vulnerable communities. And if vulnerable communities aren't able to also work with numbers and present kind of a counter narrative to the stories that are being told about them with data, then there's a huge imbalance of power that exists. I mean, we see countless decisions being made about communities with very little consultation or involvement, sort of kind of like data extractives industry where stakeholders with more power and more resources are going into vulnerable communities and taking data out of those communities without, right from the very beginning, working with communities to understand, or actually better still, empowering communities to collect data about themselves and to tell their own stories. But that aside, a redress in the power imbalance could look more like involvement right from the very beginning. We have the resources to use data to understand the needs of your community, and we want to work with you to communicate those to achieve a set of purposes. What would you like us to achieve with these purposes, with this data, and how can we do that together? But most of the community groups we're working with, that's definitely not the case for how they've been involved with data before.
So it sounds like you're saying that data literacy and storytelling, making data points accessible, is kind of a first step of translating like key insights and data that then people can use to tell and create their own stories about the problems that they're facing. Am I getting more or less what you're saying there?
I think so. And I mean, I'm not sure how I feel about that, right? Because if a community is experiencing something and they say that they're experiencing something, they're experiencing it. But for policymakers to take notice, it seems that it can be more impact. I mean, it's obviously different for different audiences, but if the numbers back up the claim, then there's more of an interest to listen to that. So yeah, it's a tricky question, but I think that's why I talk a lot about we create kind of data experiences, or we kind of shy away from necessarily always using the word data visualization or data driven. So data can be used to inform an approach. It doesn't necessarily need to be what we see as the final product. An example of that is a project that we worked on in Jordan with the Arab Women's Organization of Jordan. They had done a really great effort, data collection effort with parents of children who are at risk of early marriage. And so we worked together with them to uncover insights within that data to try and come up with a new approach that could engage fathers in dialogues. And most of their programming had targeted mothers of daughters at risk of early marriage, and they're really successful with that. But they were finding it really hard to engage fathers. So we used data that they already had to try and find an entry point into kind of sparking conversations. The final output of that data informed process was a short story competition for girls living in Jordan, aged 13 to 18. They could choose one of 4 topics to write about their hopes and dreams for the future. And to apply to the short story competition, they had to have a supporting story written by their father or primary caregiver. And out of that, the kind of impact of just starting conversations that weren't there before was really powerful. So part of storytelling is about like activating conversations, accelerating them, amplifying them. And there are lots of different ways to do that. It doesn't need to be a chart, because sometimes charts are really inaccessible too.
Yeah, I know the project that you're talking about in Jordan, and I watched a video on that you shared. And I was really impacted by just how obvious it was that the fathers and the daughters had really had deep conversations and connections, and were both really invested and excited about the nation. What do you think the key is to creating that emotional connection with people?
Yeah. I mean, I guess in some ways the story has to be accessible for people to even have an emotional connection with it. And I can explain a bit more what I mean about that with another case study. But sometimes an emotional connection or an emotional impact is not the desired outcome, right? If you're going into a UN meeting and maybe an emotional impact is not the desired outcome if you're communicating data in that context. So all of that is to say that I think first understanding the advocacy objectives or the priorities of the civil society organization. So whether that's reducing child marriage, whether that's enhancing the role of refugee leaders within the international refugee landscape. So their priorities first. Second, the audience that they're trying to reach, and really understanding that audience. So there were a number of things we knew about Jordanian fathers that meant that a lot of approaches wouldn't work. And to a certain extent, it is trial and error, but there are a lot of things that you can do first when using a kind of data-informed approach. And also an iterative approach. So making sure that when you're coming up with concepts, you're testing those with the audience and going back and revising. But if the objective is set right from the very beginning, and you're still kind of testing against that, then the outcome should align with that. So another example is an organization we worked with at our sprint, 5-day sprint in Beirut in 2018 with an organization from Yemen. And they collect amazing data. So they're called Yemen Polling Center. They have data from all across Yemen. They wanted to communicate it to international audiences. That was the easy part, but they also wanted it to be accessible to community members, and especially at the local kind of government level in Yemen. And that's where the challenges started. So we were dealing with kind of lower literacy rates for target audience, intermittent electricity, really expensive internet, not being able to connect all of the time. So if this was going to be a digital output that served an international audience as well, how are we going to create something that could work for both? And the final prototype was actually really exciting. We created a little Wi-Fi hub that could be connected to using, without an internet connection, by a smartphone device, and you could download the website from this Wi-Fi hub. The Wi-Fi hub also included surveys, and you could remotely change the survey questions when that Wi-Fi device is connected to the internet. So that also served the purpose of reducing the risk for Yemen polling center to actually be able to collect data, because they were putting their researchers at a lot of risk to go out into the field and collect data. So this was sort of a proof of concept that could be used to mitigate some of those risks. But then even within the site design itself, so it could be downloaded as a single file, even though it had audio and data visualizations in it. It was 4 megabytes, so bandwidth wouldn't be an issue. The data visualizations all had audio files explaining how to read the data visualizations. It was in both English and Arabic. The background color of the website was dark because that doesn't drain battery life as quickly as a light colored website. All of the images, there was only one image in the website, and that was on the cover page, and all of the rest were actually created in code on loading the page. So all of the data visualizations were really light. So sort of taking what we know about an audience and designing specifically for that need, it's never going to guarantee that the final output is the right one for them. And that's where iterative design and development comes in. But it certainly goes a long way to setting you on the right path.
That's many, many steps beyond just thinking about how you're designing and creating from like the back end to figure out how it's going to be used and viewed and on what devices and by whom and in what contexts. That on the front end, like that to me indicates that you have a wide range of people also working who have technical skills, who have design skills, who understand kind of obviously like the content and also the technical capacity. Which gets me to the question that I wanted to ask you about. You've talked about how data storytelling is key to undoing these typically extractive data processes, how it can be an empowering thing to communicate data. Can you talk about what the role is of communities and a larger group of stakeholders in creating these kind of data storytelling projects?
Yeah, so I don't think that the data storytelling projects themselves redress the power imbalance necessarily, because it starts before that. We're often working with communities that, as I mentioned before, that have data extracted from them. Also, sometimes just completely excluded. So if you're an LGBTQI person living in a geography where that is, it's not legal to identify as LGBTQI, then chances are if there's a survey, it's not going to disaggregate by you. So then you end up with decisions being made about your community by policymakers that don't accurately represent your specific needs. So I mean, I think that the redress of the power imbalance has to happen a lot sooner than that. And then I guess that brings it around to what we might typically call data literacy, right? So having skills, in particular at the sort of civil society organization level. And I would be talking here in particular about, for want of a better word, like rights holder group led civil society organizations. So if it's an organization working on the rights of persons with visual impairments, making sure that there are persons with visual impairments in senior roles within that organization. And then, data skills, data literacy. I think that the model a little bit is broken, and that's one of the things that we're trying to address at Data for Change, is that it doesn't seem to be as effective, this kind of fly in, fly out model where you do a 3-day intensive data skills training on sort of, I don't know, whether you cover pivot tables and advanced Excel formulas or what, whatever you could do in 3 days. It's compressed, compressing really technical skills without the opportunity to practice those or to understand how to apply them to a data advocacy strategy moving forward. Then data literacy, I don't know, it becomes less useful if it's not part of a holistic approach, I guess. Being able to tell a good story with data in some way means that you need to understand data, you need to know where it is, how to find it, using open data and all of those things that we would call data literacy. But then for me, I guess it goes beyond that. And how do you become, as an individual and as an organization, data confident? How do you know what is possible? And then how do you know, once you have those insights, the different ways that you could communicate those to different audiences to make an impact? And having those as kind of like these standalone things, like, okay, we're going to do communications training, or we're going to have a 5-day Excel workshop, or now we're going to find open data. We've had less success with that in terms of a long-term, in terms of a sustainable approach to data advocacy and having organizations carry that forward after that. So I think you asked before, and I didn't answer it, the question about how that changed with COVID. Previously, at our 5-day sprints, we also ran a more kind of traditional model, data literacy or data capacity building for the civil society organizations, alongside the kind of design sprint, where they would be having touch points each day with their creative team to produce a data-driven prototype or proof of concept, but also acquiring data storytelling skills themselves. And it was a bit hit and miss, like they were super excited by the potentials. We've got a lot of really cool software that we use and have partnerships with, so that we can provide civil society organizations with access after the training to be able to create data-driven stories. But I would love to have every organization that we work with having, I don't know if a data-first mindset is the right word, but there are so many opportunities to bring in data storytelling to existing advocacy priorities. And so it's not necessarily about like changing the whole approach, it's just integrating data in a more holistic way, having it not be just something that you do for a donor every quarter because you have to write an M&E report. And for a lot of people, data is just pre and post testing, or counting the number of outputs and presenting it in a spreadsheet to a donor to prove that. So I guess part of what we're doing now with the longer term engagement, we will work over a longer period of time, but really focusing on applying knowledge and also transferring knowledge to community members. Because I think that there's this really important part of the chain that needs to be there, which is that if you're collecting data with your community members, they also need to be part of hearing and shaping the stories that come out of that data. So it's not, making sure that you're not reinforcing that kind of extractive approach.
So you're talking about participation, including at every step, and then participation among people who are involved in the data collection and people whose data is being collected at every step in the process.
Yeah, it's also the start of a lot of conversations for us. Like, as I mentioned, COVID was a real challenge, but also an opportunity to do things a little bit differently. And so I kind of reserve the right to have maybe some different thoughts, and as time progresses. But really, for us, it's about centering our partners and empowering them to communicate with data. But yeah, I think it's something that's evolving for us as well, and is evolving in tandem with the relationships that we have with our partners.
Yeah. I guess my final question, unless there's anything else you want to add, will be where should somebody start? You mentioned that it's hard for organizations or individuals to know what's possible and what data is out there and what can be done with it. So where do you start if you're somebody at a civil society organization or a community member who's looking at the ways to use data to make change?
That's a good question, actually. I think this is the really cool thing actually about civil society organizations, is that the best place to start is looking at the work that they've done already. I mean, this is not, like, as I said before, this is not about necessarily having to do something completely new. It's about looking at what you're creating already and seeing how that could be reshaped or repurposed, and also coming up with maybe more enhanced or effective processes to capture some of the information, because we've found a lot of times that even though there's data being presented in an annual report, when we've kind of looked back with the organization to try and find the original source of that data within their organization, it might have been lost, or so looking at sort of coming up with better processes and enhanced processes in the organization. But I would say first thing to do would be to look at like the data that we already have and mapping how they're communicating the messages that data kind of speaks to. And then there are a lot of places to go to look for inspiration. One of the tools that we use a lot actually is called Shorthand. It's a codeless interactive storytelling platform that has a lot of functionality and is really amazing. And they have an annual awards every year, and there's some really, really great investigative journalism pieces. They have a whole NGO category, so you can really look at how other people are kind of telling longer form stories with data. But yeah, I don't know. I think for me, because I'm a bit of I like to search out things. There are a lot of really amazing examples out there, and the learning journey never stops. I think my kind of go-to thought is that if there is a problem to be solved, somebody has already probably solved it. This is when it comes to kind of figuring out how to work with data. And so in those cases, Google is my best friend. I think if you looked through my Google search history, it would be like, how to create a pivot table from data that does X, Y, Z. Sort of like that, but it's about, you have to have sparked a seed, have sparked the inclination to actually go further with data. And I think once you've got that really foundations level, then it's possible to find a lot of these things and resources by yourself. But until you know what's possible, that's really hard. So I don't know, where do you start? Come and do a 12-week Foundations Fellowship with Data for Change.
Well, it sounds like you're kind of saying like spark, look at examples that spark curiosity and possibility about what can happen. And then looked at, like with the Google search, like you're looking to what's already been done to.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the curiosity thing is really important, because I think it's also really important to be critical about data. So just because somebody put it in a chart, it doesn't mean that it is true or that it is the only truth. So making sure that, kind of data confidence is coupled with being able to be data critical and looking at how different things are presented and kind of tracking that back and saying, this doesn't seem quite right, and looking at why that might be.
That gets us back to the data literacy point. Well, we are out of time, Bronwen. Thank you so much. I appreciate your taking the time to talk to us and contribute to the Data Values Project. Bronwen Robertson is the co-founder and director of Data for Change, and this has been a Data Values Project Fireside Chat. You can follow the conversation on social media at #DataValues and subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up with new Fireside Chats as they're released. Thank you so much, Bronwen.
Thanks so much for having me.